All right, today we are looking at lesson 9.1. All right, solving quadratic equations and finding square roots. All right, so the key to today's lesson is the square root part. All right, if you don't understand square roots, the rest of this is going to be very, very confusing. All right, all real numbers have two square roots. So let's talk about that for just a second. Real numbers are whole numbers, they're negative numbers, they're decimal numbers, they're fractions because fractions can be written as decimals. So all real numbers will have two square roots. They will have a positive one and they will have a negative one. All right? So when we're looking at a square root, hopefully by now you recognize a square root symbol when you see one. I've got one written here on the screen for you. What I need you to understand is there is more than one name for this square root sign. All right? So this is the first thing I want you to add into your notes. I want you to draw an arrow from that symbol right there. Okay? We all know square root. All right? But I still want you to write it down. Okay? This is a square root. This is the square root of 9 if we were going to read this problem. What I also need you to understand is this is also called a radical sign. So when you see something that says a radical expression, if you know that a radical is a square root symbol, then you're going to understand the expression is a problem with the radical sign in it. Okay, so I need you to memorize that a radical sign and a square root are the exact same things. Now, the other thing I want you to understand is as we're looking at this square root of 9, all right, there is an understood number sitting right here on the lip of this square root symbol. Does anybody know what the understood number is that's sitting right there? What are you saying? Okay, is he correct? Now this is exactly why I'm asking the question, because we're so used to an understood number being a 1, okay, with our exponents and with our coefficients. But what I need you to understand about a square root is that is an understood 2 that sits right there. Think about what it's saying. The square root. The square is a 2 as an exponent. Okay, so there's an understood 2. Now, if I were to write something and I were to stick a 3 on that ledge right there, well, now I want the third root of 9. If I went back and I did a 5 right there, well, I want the fifth root of 9. All right, but I want you to understand if there is nothing there, it is an understood 2. All right, they're not going to put it, but it's understood. Okay, any questions so far? All right, now we've got to know how to read this. And here's the first thing I need you to understand, and you might even want to add this to your notes. Anytime they give us a problem and the radical sign is already there, they're asking us for the positive answer. Okay, remember we just talked about that all real numbers have two square roots. They have a positive number and they have a negative number. All right, if we were to think about 9, what is the square root of 9? 3. Okay? Because 3 times 3, or 3 squared, equals what? Okay? What does negative 3 times negative 3 equal? 9. So do you see how that the square root of 9 is both 3 and negative 3? But here's the trick. If the radical sign is already in my problem, so if I'm looking at letter A on example 1, the radical sign is already there. So I actually read this, and this is what I want you guys to write down, okay? The positive square root. The positive square root of 9. Okay, so I need you to understand, if the radical is already in the original problem, then all you are giving me is the positive answer. But that is the positive square root of 9. So what is the positive square root of 9? Class, what is it? 3. Very good. Letter B. How do we read this? Now I need you to think back to our absolute value lesson where we had the absolute value symbol and we had a negative in front of it. Does anyone remember the correct way to read letter B? No, that would be a natural way to try to read it, negative square root of 9. But what's the actual way that we read this? Noah?
Minus square root.
No, good try. Anybody else have a guess? How about the opposite of?
Opposite of.
Remember when we did absolute value and it was the opposite of. Okay, the opposite of the square root of 9. Now, what is the square root of 9? 3. And what's the opposite of 3? Negative 3. All right, so the opposite of the square root of 9. Now, look at letter C. Does anybody know how to read that fun little symbol right here in front of the square root of 9? Does anybody know how to read that? I don't know if you've probably seen it before, not this year, but you've seen it in the past. Okay, we read letter C simply as plus or minus the square root of 9. So anytime you're giving me both the positive and the negative answer to a square root problem, you can just use that symbol, the plus over the minus sign. But we read it as plus or minus the square root of 9. Okay, and it's really important that you guys are writing this down because you need to be able to reference, go back and look at how to read this. All right, letter D. The square root of negative 9. All right, the square root of negative 9. Pretty simple. Okay, the square root, we're back to just reading the square root of and then whatever number is underneath. However, what do you think the square root of negative 9 is?
Negative 3.
Okay, that would make sense as a thought. All right, but guess what? At this point in your math career, if you see a negative number under the radical, your answer is no solution. If you were to stick that in your calculator, it's going to say error, which will be your reminder that that's no solution. Now, some of your calculators are super fancy, and they would give you an answer of 3i. But do you know anything about I at this point? No. You're going to learn one day. You're going to learn one day that you have to pull that negative sign out and turn it into an I and then go from there. But right now, you don't need to worry about any of that. Okay, this is Algebra 1. So for right now, we're leaving it as no solution. And again, if you stick it, excuse me, if you stick it in your calculator, it's going to say error. So let that remind you that it is no solution. All right, so now that we've got that out of the way, are there any questions? All right, let's move on to example number 2. We see the word evaluate in our instructions. Please remind me what the word evaluate means. To solve, all right? To solve. So they want us to evaluate the expression. We know it's an expression because what is not in it? What makes this an expression and not an equation? There's no equal sign, all right? Good. Just throwing that out there to see if you remember. All right, now it says give the exact value. So if you have a perfect square, when your answer comes out to be a whole number, it's called a perfect square. But if you get a perfect square, you're going to give me that exact value. If not, they want you to round to the nearest hundredth. How many decimal places is the nearest hundredth? 2. Very good. All right. So let's look at letter A. Don't touch your calculators yet because 36 is what kind of a square? Is it a perfect square or is it not a perfect square? It's a perfect square. Izzy?
6.
It is 6. All right. But Izzy, before you give me that answer, I want you to read letter A to me. How do I read letter A? Very good. The opposite of the square root of 36. And you told me the square root of 36 is 6. And of course, the opposite of 6 is negative 6. Okay? So your answer is negative 6. Your answer is negative 6. All right? Letter B. Zach, how do I read letter B?
Exactly. So on which one?
You, Silcox.
You read B by the positive of 8. Positive square root.
Okay? We're technically reading this as the square root of 8, which is the positive square root of 8. They only want the positive answer. So, is that a perfect square, Zach?
Mm-hmm.
What is it?
4.
Now think about that.
Wait,
Hold on. Let him think about it. If you're saying 4 is your answer, you're saying 4 times 4 is 8.
No.
And you know that's not true. So, is it a perfect square? No. So, at this point, we got to plug it in our calculator. All right? Now, I don't know about your Casio, but most of these Casios the one I'm holding has a radical button, a square root button. So you simply hit that button and then you punch in 8. Now, this calculator says 2 times the square root of 2. That's another type of exact answer, and it will tell you in the instructions whether or not it wants you to leave your answer with a radical. All right, but this set of instructions wants us to round to the nearest hundredth, so I'm going to hit my S to D button and change it to a decimal. All right, what do I get, Kennedy, as my decimal? 2.8. Good. If we round to the nearest hundredth, it's 2.83. And again, we've already talked about they only want the positive answer, so 2.83. All right, great job. Are there any questions? All right, let's look at this one. Now, example 3 again says evaluate. Okay, so remember when we evaluate, we are solving. All right, and they want us to evaluate the square root of b squared minus 4ac for the given values. Now, this is important, and here's why. This is a portion of a bigger formula that you are going to learn next week. All right, so I want you, each and every time you work a problem, including in your homework, I want you to write this formula down. All right, the best way to memorize this thing is to write it down. So it's the square root of b squared minus 4ac. Now let's talk about what's underneath the radical, okay? B squared. If I plug a positive number in there, my answer is going to be what? Positive. If I plug a negative number in there and square it, my answer is going to be what? Positive. So when I evaluate b squared in this formula, and in the formula we're going to learn next week, my first number will never be negative. Does that make sense? If I'm plugging a value in for b and I'm squaring it, is my answer ever going to be negative? No. Okay? We are going to make sure we plug all values in parentheses. Now here's why. Look at negative 4, because every number has a sign, the sign's directly in front of it. So negative 4, a, and c. What am I doing to negative 4, a, and c? I'm multiplying, right? There's no sign between the negative 4 and the a and the c. So that indicates multiplication. So when I plug these values in, I'm plugging them in parentheses. So Reagan, what am I plugging in place of b?
Negative 3.
Look at your b value.
Oh, sorry.
Negative 2. So we're plugging negative 2 in and we're squaring it. Minus 4. We're plugging a in. What's a?
1.
1. So in parentheses, I'm plugging a 1. And what's c?
Negative 3.
Negative 3. So notice I plugged b, a, and c. I plugged them all in parentheses. Now, once we've done that, we have to follow the order of operations. So Janicia, order of operations says I have to do what first? In this particular problem? The exponent, okay? I have no work in the parentheses to do, so I move on to my exponent work. All right, negative 2 squared. What does that give me, Janicia? Be careful. Remember what we talked about. Will my first value ever be negative? It can't be. I'm squaring it. Negative 2 times negative 2 is a positive 4. So it's always going to be a positive number. All right, Janicia, keep going. Now, I've got options here. I can plug exactly what I see, which is negative 4 times 1 times negative 3 into my calculator. Or I can figure out if my answer is going to be plus or minus. How many negative signs are in this portion of the problem? So if there's an even amount of negative signs, then is my answer going to be positive or negative? Positive. So once I figure that out, now I'm just doing 4 times 1 times 3. Okay, so it's up to you. If you want to plug the negatives into the calculator, okay, or if you want to include the negatives when you're doing this in your head because you don't need a calculator, that's fine. But remember the rule. If there's an even amount of negative signs, your answer is positive. If there's an odd amount of negative signs, your answer will be negative. But Janicia, what's 4 times 1 times 3? 12. Awesome. Fernando, what's 4 plus 12? Good. And what is, Noah, the square root of 16? 4. Now, is it just positive 4? Yes. Again, the radical was in the problem when we started. And I keep saying that because it's going to be different tomorrow. Tomorrow, we're going to introduce, okay? We're going to introduce the radical sign to the problem, and that changes everything. So recognize that the radical sign is already in the problem, meaning you only give the positive answer. Any questions?
No.
All right. I want you to take a minute and work letter B. All right. Zach Sizemore, first of all, I want you to tell me what we're plugging in for each of our values. Again, we're writing down the formula. Make sure you write down the square root of b squared minus 4ac every single time, including when you work on your homework tonight. All right, the square root of b squared minus 4ac. So Zach Sizemore, what are we plugging in for b? Good, I'm plugging it in parentheses. Minus 4 times a, which is -2, and c, which is +2. Okay, and we'll just extend that radical out. All right, Izzy, order of operations tells us to do what first? Good, and when we do our power or our exponent, what do we get?
9.
+9. Again, remember, that first number will never ever be negative because we're always squaring the number. All right, Izzy, -4 times -2 times 2. Is my answer going to be positive or negative? Good, there's 2 negative signs here and here. And an even amount of negative signs gives me a positive answer. And then when you do the math, Izzy, what do you get? 4 times 2 is 8, and 8 times 2 is 16. 9 plus 16, class, is what? 25. And what is the square root of 25? 5. 5 times 5 is 25. That's what makes it the square root. What number times itself will give me 25? All right. Any questions? All right.